All right. Okay, so hello there, everyone. Welcome to this Leaders in Medicine with Med School Mentor. We have the distinguished Dr. Manish Aghi here today joining us. He is the professor and vice chair of neurosurgery at the University of California, San Francisco, as well as the co-leader of the Neurologic Oncology Program for the UCSF Helen Diller Family Comprehensive Cancer Center. And he is also one of my mentors as I am currently in his lab. So I just want to say thank you to Dr. Augie for joining us today, and we're just going to ask some questions.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right. So I wanted to start by asking one of the questions. I had seen a quote from you, Dr. Augie, saying that you have discovered much about cancer in your lab and operating room, but it is the patients that have taught you what it means to be a good doctor. And so I wanted to just follow up on this. What exactly have your patients throughout the years taught you about how to be a better doctor and today?
Yeah, it's a great question. think, when you spend time with patients, um, it really instills in you the perseverance, and you get to know the people you're um, fighting on behalf of, both in the lab and in the operating room, in the clinic. And, they're very special and unique people. And I think the more you listen to them and get to know them, the more um, passionate you can find yourself being about your work. Um, in the absence of that, I think um, you can fall into the trap of treating it like a job or an obligation, and it's a bad trap to fall into because it's very hard work, but I think the more committed you are to it, the better your results will be. And that commitment comes first and foremost from getting to know our patients and the unique things they bring to life and the functionality and the contributions they make to the world through their jobs and how you can get them back to those jobs or get them back to their loved ones is really the crux of what we do every day.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Aghi, kind of following up Jake's question, you face on your routine incurable diseases, horrible tumors. I want to know how has carrying this weight and supporting patients through such challenges shaped your perspective on life compared to when you were a medical student?
Yeah, I think you know, as you advance in your career, the sort of constant reminders of the finite nature of human life sort of start to accumulate, and both in your personal life and in your professional life. And you reach that point where you don't take moments for granted, and you appreciate the small things, and you learn not to fixate um uh minor setbacks, and not let them, not obsess over them.
Thanks, you, sir. Thank you.
Professor, as a follow-up question, in a specialty where setbacks such as failed experiments, clinical complications, or even the loss of patients are inevitable, how have you managed to preserve your identity and sense of purpose as both a scientist and a neurosurgeon? And has that identity shifted over the years?
Yeah, it I think the if you choose this specialty, you are it's very important. And one of the things that I tell people is you can't just choose the specialty because of the good moments. And um you have to be very you have to embrace the good and the bad, embrace the triumphs and the defeats, and let them make you a better person. And I think over the years, those experiences have made me more resilient and more humble and more even keeled. You start to realize that, you just develop this experience to fall back upon where you've seen things before that are invariably worse than what might happen in that moment in time, or you've experienced things that are better. So no moment is necessarily in isolation going to dramatically alter what you're doing.
So, just to make clear for the audience, everybody can raise their hands and ask a question. We are going to start with Jaber. I'm going to promote you to panelist, and you can feel free to open your mic and your face cam. Yeah, you can do it, Jaber. You can ask your question. Just unmute your mic.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
we can
yeah,
hear
we
you.
can.
First of all, I want to thank you for this session and for this webinar. For us IMGs, we don't have these like mentor webinars to guide us. I would thank you all. Thank you the med school mentor. To be not all, I want to ask Professor, like us IMGs, we need how I say, like a road, map road, great map road for us to can enjoy the specialty first, and we can embrace the hardships along the journey. And my second question is like we are IMGs. What about the ideal way to can get the residency spot in neurosurgery in the US? I think there are a lot of ways, but I want to know which the best way or the ideal way roadmap. How can a student from another country enhance his opportunities? How he can enter research in neurosurgery? Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt that the international graduate pathway to medicine in general is very difficult. And then within medicine, if you are choosing a specialty like neurosurgery that is already the most competitive and turning away um, US graduates at a higher rate than other specialties, then it's going to be quite an uphill battle. Um, the the data that we have on um, matching into neurosurgery is that, um, as you alluded to, previous research plays a big role in that. And in the case of foreign grads, that's um, also very true. Um, in the case of foreign grads, anecdotally at least, it seems like the chances, although they're always going to be hard, can benefit a little bit from having a very long-term established relationship with a research mentor in a clinically relevant research topic, um, and a mentor that has, connections and ties to the field of neurosurgery whose recommendation can carry some weight. Even with all of those things, I mean, I know of several examples of people who've done those things. It's still quite hard, but it's at least, a starting point. But it is a very tough journey, as you alluded to.
Dr. Aghi, I want to follow up on that topic regarding the IMG's match to residency. and especially regarding research. Um, Recently, I cited one of your papers that you co-authored on the arms race back in 2019, and I want to hear from you. You are a prestigious researcher and scientist, and I want to hear what do you think about the arms race, and what are your what do you expect from someone that is from out of the US and doesn't have access to research, never went to a lab in his life. How can a candidate like this compete for a paid research fellowship position on the US without boosting up numbers?
So, in general, the arms race is a term that's been used for um, applications that have become so saturated with applicant accomplishments that it becomes very difficult to differentiate, and you end up turning away people with, you know, dozens of accomplishments who, might otherwise seem on paper to be qualified. It's not just true in neurosurgery, but it's been described in orthopedic surgery. The landscape for med school applications is very similar, and to some degree, any field like where there's limited spots creates such a premium on competitiveness that an arms race is an unavoidable and unfortunate byproduct of that. Um, with that background in mind, I think for IMGs getting research spots, I think it's a matter of persistence. It's also a matter of uh, you end up having to contact a lot of people. And you also have to be respectful of the fact that the people you contact are getting hundreds of these emails a day. I, don't, as one human being, have the bandwidth to reply to all these, no matter how frequently they are sent. And so while you may be, sort of cutting and pasting and sending the same inquiries over and over, in some ways, like targeting your inquiries, doing some homework as to who you're contacting, and and just um, sometimes all it takes is like or there may be more success when again, not this won't be true for every IMG, but if there's somebody from your school who was able to get a research spot a few years ago and contacting that person's mentor, there just needs to be something where the person getting the email is going to have some way of registering who you are. That'll increase the odds of a reply. And then in your email, being very specific about um, what what experience you have that might be of relevance to that what that specific person is doing can be helpful. I mean, if I get an email from someone talking about vascular neurosurgery, it might be very well written, but I don't do vascular neurosurgery, so I'm not really, able to reply, and I don't sort of have a anatomic skull base lab that, we have one in our department, but I'm not the person to contact for that. And so I think it's just, the more you've done your homework, the better. I think attending meetings and getting to meet people in person can be helpful. Obviously, there's a cost associated with that, but I have heard anecdotally that that can sometimes be helpful. But um, I mean, it's challenging, but I think the advice I'd give is to balance the mass emails with a little more personalized touch where you're exhibiting some knowledge of what the person does and how you can contribute would be helpful.
And to follow up on that question as well, uh, what do you expect of a mentee when he's at your lab? What are the things that you want him to learn and the skills that you expect from him?
Yeah, so I mean, I have researchers engaging in both clinical projects and basic science projects. And so, I think we typically start with clear expectations about what the person is interested in doing. A number of times we may have people interested in engaging in both types of research, which is fine. But on the basic science side, we're looking to get them skilled in the tools that the lab does, mouse surgeries, flow cytometry, um, molecular sequencing and profiling of tumors. And on the clinical side, just collecting data sets for specific diseases with the goal of asking specific questions. And particularly with an MD, or anyone who has an MD, whether it's from overseas or the US, I mean, the expectation is that you're going to, once you get settled in within a few weeks, be capable of at least delineating questions you want to answer on the research side, questions that are going to be meaningful and impactful and of interest to our research group. And then, we can help you develop the tools you need to answer those questions. But in general, the more independent you're able to become and the quicker you're able to become independent, the better the chances of success in our research group. And I think that's probably true about research in general.
Thank you, sir.
And Professor, when you think about your legacy as a mentor, what values beyond surgical skill itself do you think would be the best thing for a trainee to carry on throughout his journey?
I think the the environment that we create in the lab can and the ways that people succeed in that environment are very helpful in life in general, but particularly residency, which is often where people will go after time in the lab. And so those include being a team player. And I think that's an underrated skill because we've seen applicants for our residency, who are sub-interns, et cetera. And one of the things that distinguishes very good sub-interns from less optimal sub-interns is um, having a priority on being a team player and not just being there to get the information for yourself so that you can grow, but passing it on and training people below you and doing those things well. If people can leave the lab with that mindset, to me that's a huge part of what we do. And then also just being forthright when you and telling and being self-aware of what your strengths and weaknesses are and when you're comfortable in doing something and when you can accept responsibility and do something versus when you acknowledging when you might need help, and being frank about those things, being honest is a key part of the medical field. I mean, if you can't lack of transparency and honesty in medical teams is a huge part of, avoidable medical errors and something in a human cause of avoidable medical errors and one that really should never happen. And so I think having a framework around that is very important. I tell everyone that we recruit to the lab that teaching is a big part of being in the lab, and you can't just go and do experiments off by yourself. You have an obligation to take on trainees yourself when you're in the lab, just like we're taking you on. And so those are some of the values that we hope people take with them when they leave the lab.
That's great. Thank you.
And then another question about mentorship for people in our audience. So, could you share an example of a lesson from a mentor that changed how you approach either neurosurgery or research, especially in your earlier part of your career?
Um, so an example that comes to mind is early on when I first started with a small research group. There was a trainee in the lab who was getting to be had been there for a little while, and as often as can sometimes happen when you're as a trainee in an environment that you've maybe outgrown, but you don't have like you haven't successfully found um, uh, a next step in your career, this person became pretty frustrated, and the personality was becoming difficult for people in the lab and being around. And this person was, having difficulty getting acceptance into their next step, which is, medical or graduate school. And I had written recommendation letters. The person had been performing well, and nothing had really panned out, and they were getting quite frustrated. And then ultimately, it led to sort of a, a non-renewal of contract, and the person went into a different research environment. And it was very unfortunate because you never want to see someone let go, and it's one of my few experiences with something like that. And the environment in the lab became normal after this person left, but I ran into this person, several months later, and they had landed on their feet and advanced in their career, and even, apologized for being difficult towards the end, and we made amends. We were good. But one of the things I realized that I could have done differently, and it sort of came up with subsequent mentees as I dove deeper into the process of, helping people advance to the next stage of their careers, which is, asking myself as a mentor, have I done everything possible to help this person land on their feet? As we alluded to with our discussion of the arms race, it's very competitive, right? To get positions in med school or residency, et cetera. And you know, I sort of felt almost that I had let this person down, right? I just wrote them a letter and sort of moved on. And so the answer to that question, had I done everything possible in hindsight, was no. And so, at that point, and since then, when I have somebody who's applying or moving on or asking for, additional letters, et cetera, I will not just send letters, but in scenarios where it's appropriate, pick up the phone and call people to advocate for this person, or send personalized emails to the contacts I might have at those programs. And as you get older, you become a little more networked in the medical community, and there's more that you can do to help people. And so I think that's one of the things that I realized I was falling short of, and sort of, if I'm holding my trainees to the highest possible standard, then the least I can do is hold myself to that highest possible standard. So that's one example of a early lesson I learned.
Thank you so much for that answer.
So I'm going to unmute. Bezona just lowered her hand. I'm going to unmute Sebastian. You can ask a question, unmute your microphone. Yeah, you can do it, Sebastian.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for letting me ask my question. My question for you, Dr. Aghi, is I've heard many things from different neurosurgeons in different residency in positions of leadership and, for example, residency admissions about research specificity in the field. So, for example, how do you look at residency applicants if their research is not necessarily within neurosurgery specifically, like their PhD, for example, versus it is? Do you see that as difference between applicants if they have research specificity in neurosurgery, or do you appreciate, say, a candidate having a different perspective and then coming in for the residency? Just wanted to get your take.
Yeah, and it's a common question that we get from students, including at UCSF where I teach. Um, and there's definitely no one size fits all. I mean, and so I can't say with a broad sweep that I, definitively always 100% of the time prioritize neurosurgical research over non-neurosurgical research. That being said, I think it is going to be more compelling if the candidate can put together some sort of narrative explaining how that research um, positions them to make an impact in the field of neurosurgery. Um, and so I think that it is quite possible to make a claim that research that on the surface is not neurosurgically relevant can be used to build a neurosurgically relevant research portfolio. But you have to be able to make that argument in order for me to give your research priority. Otherwise, one of the problems is if you come to me and did research in uh, you know, like bunions on the feet or something, and you fully acknowledge that it's not relevant to neurosurgery. My concern is even if I say, okay, fine, this person learned how to pipette and has some basic skills that can translate. My concern is that this is someone who intellectually, started out interested in topic A and is now interested in neurosurgery as topic B. And neurosurgery is a 7-year, residency commitment. And neurosurgeons are inherently not looking on to add extra risk to that calculation. And somebody who changed their minds, you know, and halfway through a or a few years into a career, um, I need some demonstration that that's not going to happen again before I commit resources to training you. Um, the caveat to all this is, of course, with everyone, you're meeting them, you're hearing their story, you're looking them in the eye, and there's exceptions. There's people who can convince you, but in the abstract, that would be my answer or concern about the scenario with the non-neurosurgically relevant research.
Thank you, sir. Uh, Bezona, I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question. Here you go. You can turn your camera on as well.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks, Mathieu. Thank you, Dr. Aghi, for being on tonight to take our questions and give us a little bit of a talk. It's always wonderful to have someone to give like some guidance. So my question is maybe following up on as a piggyback to the whole I am just new into research and trying to sort of get your feet into it. The challenges that we find starting most times when you send out emails or go to conferences or meet people, they go, well, send me your CV. And that's the first step. That's fine. When you send your CV or if you send an email with your CV, they go, well, no, you don't have the experience that we're looking for. And that's perfectly fine. But how are we going to get that experience to be helpful if we're not given a chance?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, unfortunately, the current climate around research and research funding has changed so much so that, a few years ago you could add someone with no experience in a volunteer capacity um, and have them shadow someone and, take up and, get them some exposure. But now we are so, all of our energy, both the lead investigator and the research team is so focused on results that, that time it takes to give someone experience who'd never had it before has become more and more of a luxury. But effectively, that is still the only way to get experience. If you're inexperienced and looking to get some experience, then typically at most institutions, a volunteer capacity is the only way to do that because nobody has sort of the funding to convert to just throw at a volunteer who may or may not acquire the necessarily skills to succeed. Um, and then it's challenging, right? Because some institutions don't even have volunteer positions anymore. But if an institution has a volunteer position, then that is the only pathway to get the exposure. But I know in our case with, for example, wet lab, we can't really have somebody come in even in a volunteer capacity who's never done any wet lab because, they can contaminate specimens, they can make mistakes, even in a volunteer capacity that can be very impactful in a negative way. And then on the clinical research side, we've had some volunteers, but if they themselves might be a student volunteer with the skill sets, but asking them to then not do anything, slow themselves down just to teach someone how to access an EMR is very tricky. All that being said, though, that remains the challenge, which is, to find an environment that can add you in a volunteer capacity and give you the exposure you need. I think the keys, if you're going to do that, are that you have to be a very fast study because the time when you're shadowing is non is not necessarily productive time. And so demonstrating that you can actually go from inexperienced volunteer to like actual contributor to the team needs to be, quick in order to really maximize the benefit. Um, and then the other question becomes, what's the perfect environment or situation for a volunteer international person? And, I think many times somebody who's newly hired at an institution that may not get a lot of US students, might be the best suited for that. Um, I mean, when I first started as faculty, I probably took on more sort of inexperienced volunteers because I didn't really have the luxury of um, more experienced team members. And so sometimes new faculty can fill that role or be the best to contact. So one of the traps that international applicants may fall into is targeting the names that they've heard of before, like, Harvard or UC San Francisco or UCLA or whatever. And the reality is that it's totally fine to reach out to those programs, but sometimes it's the programs that you haven't heard of that may be most open to the international students.
Thanks, sir. I'm going to unmute Jabber now. Jabber, you can turn on your camera and your mic.
Hello again. Thank you, Dr. Aghi, for these precious information. I have another question is I heard about the pre-residency fellowships. It's like a training for the residency, like it's 1 year or 2 years. I don't know exactly. And they train the residents to how to perform in the actual residency of if they match. If you know some information or you can enhance this topic for us, please. And the second question is if the applicant he is interested in neurosurgery, but if he has some like research in clinical neurology, if it is important or it doesn't count in the real assessment for the applicant. And how the PhD can, like in PhD in neuroscience in the US or in outside the US in top tier institutions, can play the role in the assessment of the applicants. Thank you, Dr. Aghi, again.
Yeah, pre-residency fellowships have become a nice vehicle for international trainees. The one that I have some knowledge or familiarity of is at the University of Miami, but my understanding is there are more of them than that. I don't know of any centralized resource that organizes them, but I know when I visited, for example, University of Miami and interacted with some of the pre-residency fellows that it definitely is a nice resource to give you a glimpse into what residency is and to try to develop some relevant skill sets. And I think in some ways, pre-residency fellowships are, when they're managed correctly, can address concerns that U.S. programs, or can address some of the structural barriers that um, exist for matching in U.S. programs for international graduates, which is um, the the lack of international standardization makes it so that we don't really always get a good sense of how good a foreign graduate is compared to a U.S. graduate. And pre-residency fellowships, because they're standardized and run at accredited U.S. hospitals, and when we speak to the person who's recommending you, they are typically not only running a pre-residency fellowship, but running a residency as well. So if they say that you can be a good U.S. resident, that really means a lot. And in some ways, that's one of the strongest endorsements you can get as a foreign graduate. One of the downsides of research is that even if you even if you come as a foreign graduate with very high impact research, which sometimes can happen, that doesn't always tell us anything about how you'd function in the hospital. And so I think pre-residency fellowships can potentially very nicely address that gap. Um, and then regarding the question of neurology and neuroscience research, I think that's, as relates to the previous question about neurosurgically relevant research or not, that's at least getting, to research that has more potential overlap. So, when we say research is either neurosurgically relevant or not, it's not a binary thing. And you can have research that's, maybe not perfectly neurosurgically relevant, but at least somewhat neurosurgically relevant. And I think doing research in things like Alzheimer's disease or dementia is at least getting close to neurosurgery in a way that, you as the applicant could potentially even, put together a compelling argument as to why it might be neurosurgically relevant. So I think that's a reasonable, that is something that if you had that on your CV, we would certainly, take a close look.
Thank you, Dr. Aghi. Uh, as a high achiever, Dr. Aghi, what strategies do you use to cope with stress? I know you like to run, so it's running, doing exercises, one of them.
Yeah, so I think exercise is a big one. There's a lot of documented research on the benefits that exercise has for stress. Um, I think spending time with family is, and, you know, letting go of stress when you spend time with your family is very important. Um, and I think some of it just comes with age and experience. I've gotten a lot better at, tuning things out than I used to be. Um, almost everything that, as you get older, almost everything stressful or bad that happens to you, you can recall something similarly bad that happened at some point in the past, and you're still alive and you're still doing well. So that must not have been as bad as it seemed in the moment. And so I think you reach a point where you you literally have ample evidence that this too shall pass. So it's pretty manageable. And I think um, you start to see people older than you winding down their careers, and you realize that during the course of those careers, they probably had a million, you know, obstacles and barriers and bad days, and everybody comes out in the end, in pretty good shape. So it's um it's pretty, it gets a lot easier to maintain that perspective as you get older. I think, aside from exercise and time with family, um, you know, watching movies, going to concerts, just keeping yourself entertained, and is always good.
Thank you, sir.
And Professor, as the next question, I'm starting a humble research team myself, and regarding that topic, I would like to ask you how discipline can extend beyond personal habits in creating a culture of rigor and accountability, and how have you perfected that on your lab?
That's a great question. So I think I think one of the things is just you know, people will the culture, the PI or the faculty sets the culture from above. And so, people will have their own cadence and pace, but they will react to what they see you do, and many times they'll model behavior that you do as the faculty member. And so, for me, I think there's this recognition that research really doesn't, or neurosurgery for that matter, adhere to like a 9 to 5, 40-hour work week. That doesn't mean that, we're constantly, that we're working 160 hours. Like, it's not about the number, but it's more about one of the things that is great about, um, my job is that while the hours are long, you know, with some exceptions, such as, physically, literally being in the operating room or being in clinic, like you have the ability when you're just when you're not being productive or when your mind isn't there to like, take a break. But then you also have the ability to like, do something neurosurgically relevant if inspiration strikes you in the middle of the night. And so I think working when you're productive and walking away when you're not productive. And people will hear from me with all sorts of random ideas at odd hours, and they know that I'm not just like shutting down thinking about research after 5 p.m. And that's sort of the behavior that gets modeled. And it isn't meant to be abusive. I mean, I have people over to my house, they see I have a very normal family and I spend a lot of time with them. But knowing that, I'm not shutting down that the the my brain, when the clock strikes 5 is a culture and a behavior that, people when they see you replicate that will model because, I have seen, colleagues who when they leave, they're just offline, for the weekend or for the whole time. And I think that's just not the way I'm wired. And I think in the research climate, it's pretty tough to be like that.
So my next question, Dr. Aghi, is looking back, what do you wish you had known about handling setbacks and failures at different stages of your career?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think um, overall, I feel like I've managed to navigate most setbacks and failures without sort of long-term harm. But I think um, there were a few setbacks and failures that I probably dwelled on a little longer than I needed to. And I think there there's some things that we end up falling into the trap of wanting so badly that we lose perspective. And when we don't get those specific things, we we unnecessarily deflate our self-worth. And the reality is there's nothing wrong with having ambition for, you know, research funding or material possessions or professional advancement. But the moment you start linking your self-worth to those things, you're putting yourself at risk of being unhappy and unfulfilled in a completely unnecessary way. And so I think the few times that I've been really, knocked for a loop by failure, I wished that I had not linked the goal of the pursuit to my self-worth. Because your self-worth isn't about, a specific grant or title or career advancement. It's about, who you are as a physician, who you are as a parent, who you are as a spouse, and who you are as a researcher, and that's always going to be detached from titles and things, lines on your CV.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Aghi, I want to move a little from our subject now. Uh, I want to ask you, what inspired you to pursue both MD and PhD? And how did your PhD research influence your approach to neurosurgery?
That's a great question. So, my background is I was a college student at Stanford University, was interested in being a physician. I mean, I considered myself pre-med the whole time, but my route to, or my, because you can't really treat patients when you're a college student, what you end up doing is research, or at least for me, that's what I ended up doing. And I enjoyed research a lot. And, I worked in Irv Weissman's lab on stem cell biology and stem cells as relates to cancer were mostly not brain cancer per se, but like I think hematologic malignancies. And was interested in immunology and the immunology of cancer and started and became aware of MD PhD programs as a way of becoming a physician scientist. In the lab, there were MD PhDs who were mostly doing research, but would see patients, maybe 10% patient care, 90% research. And I didn't know much about the different options, but broadly speaking, being an MD PhD seemed like a, a modification to my pre-med interests, like a slight tweak that I became interested in. And then, um, there were medical scientist training programs that were funded by the government, and I said, oh, and all the med schools seem to have one. I was like, oh, this looks pretty cool. And so then I applied MD PhD towards the end of college, my senior year. I took my very first exposure to the brain, took a neuroscience course, became interested in neuroscience, broadly speaking. And so some of my MD PhD applications were submitted to neuroscience programs. And I was accepted to the neuroscience program at Harvard, and enrolled there. And then started looking at labs to rotate through initial. And one of the things that I think separated me from other MD PhDs is as I alluded to, there were people I had seen in the lab who were like seeing patients once a month. And I was like, well, what's the point of getting an MD if you're just going to see patients once a month? And you're barely different than a PhD at that point. And so to me, I was hoping to get sort of do research that was directly related to human disease and ideally spend 50% of my time seeing patients. And this is as a first year MD PhD. So for my first rotation was in studying Alzheimer's biology. And, it checked some of those boxes. You could be a neurologist treating Alzheimer's patients um, and, uh, and you could, do translationally relevant research. But I didn't enjoy the experience as much because the clinical side of Alzheimer's disease just wasn't for me. It was somewhat irreversible and severe dementia, et cetera. And so then in the back of my mind, I was like, well, I still have this interest in cancer immunology. And so I started looking for brain cancer labs. And, most of them were actually in cell biology in different departments, but I did find one, Xander Breakfield's lab at MGH. She had an appointment in neuroscience, in part because she did gene therapy for neurologic disorders, but there was people in her lab doing gene therapy for brain tumors. And I met with those folks and fell in love. And several of them were neurosurgeons, including Dr. Kioka, who was uh, at the time, a resident working in her lab. And And I met him and sort of observed him doing surgery. And at that point, it was pretty clear. But prior to that, I will say I had some second thoughts about should I just forgo the PhD and go straight through med school. And I had encountered neurosurgeons in the lab. And so I said, do I really need the PhD at this point? I could still do research as an MD. And I think that's one of my take-home messages would be like, you don't really need to be MD PhD. It's, just something I had enrolled in it out of interest. But then meeting Nino and seeing and hearing about his PhD work and how it sort of made him a better scientist, and I was already literally in a lab as an MD PhD student, it was pretty clear to me that I needed to see this through to completion. And in answer to the question, it became a formative experience. It's not, is it a necessary experience? No, but it was 3 years, 3.5 years where all I did was research. It's the only time in my life, right? From that moment on, you're not going to have time when your brain isn't hardwired to also be thinking about patient care. And so for me, that it was so long ago, but it really was very formative. And so it made me a better scientist and taught me some core skills that, when I write grants and edit research grants that trainees write, I think there's still things that I do that I learned as a PhD student. So those are some of the things. It's not about the techniques or the technologies, which pretty much every technology I used as a PhD student is now obsolete, and it's just the way it is. But it's more about thinking about problems and how to convince people that your science is impactful.
Thank you, sir. And to follow up with this question, a lot of attendings and med students ask this all the time, and it's a major doubt in their uh, on how do you choose a mentor? So I want to hear from you. Uh, what are the qualities and skills that you look for in a mentor?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, a good mentor is going to make themselves available for you, offer guidance, advice, and re and engage and give feedback when you have ideas, when you write up proposals, when you write articles. I will often micro edit proposals and articles that are sent to me. Um, and my hope is that the trainee won't just sort of accept all my suggestions or feedback, but will actually read them from the perspective of, understanding what I was thinking as I gave that feedback. In some cases, if I think it might not be abundantly clear, I'll spell it out so they can really, learn from it. And the way you see that as a mentor is, if the trainee on, the second iteration, third iteration is taking into account the style that you're trying to teach. And so I think having that sort of having a mentor who's doing those things is very important. Um, I think the other thing, though, that um, is important is, I'm sure Jake would agree with this based on, what I know is that as you get more, there's a tendency for people to say, oh, I'm looking for a mentor. And the reality is, like, if you're going to have a successful pathway to whatever your next step is, residency, med school, et cetera, you're likely going to have more than one mentor. I mean, almost I did, everyone did. So, you know, you're the most of us are looking for mentors, not a mentor. And so your individual mentor, whether it's me or someone else, may not fulfill every one of your needs, but this is not sort of your mentor is not a biological parent where you can only have one or two. There's no limit on the number of mentors you can have. Um, and so I think having a core group of mentors that you can trust who collectively impart on you the wisdom you need to succeed is the key. And the reality is like no single mentor has the bandwidth to turn you into like, the perfect applicant or the perfect resident. But, in our residency program, we have, you know, 12 or 13 core faculty, and our residents become good not because of any one of those, but because of all 12 or 13. And when they graduate at their graduation, they make a point of saying that. They thank all of us, and they tell anecdotes about how each of us impacted them, not, one person.
Well, I can speak to personal experience that being mentored by you, Dr. Aghi, so far has been an amazing experience. And I've also been mentored by everyone else in the lab that you have mentored as well. And then people from my home institution mentoring me as well. So I totally agree. Having multiple mentors is not just preferred, but I think necessary. And you get to learn a lot from everyone's opinions and everything like that. So I just wanted to say thank you again, Dr. Aghi, for coming today to give us this information. This information was extremely valuable to everyone here, including us as panelists and the attendees. So we thank you for your time. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us here today.
All right. Thank you all.
Yeah. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.